Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name's Jeff Thomas, and we've got our trusty co-host with us, Jeff Rutt. Say hello to the people, Jeff.
Hello to the people.
And we have a very special guest this week, Bob Caldwell Jr. Yes, that means there's a senior. There was a senior. So Bob is the president of Grace Management Group, which is a group of privately held fragrance brands. I think it's the first fragrance company we've had on. And Bob, I just can't help but making the joke that you smell fabulous on Zoom. Anyway, thank you for being with us, Bob.
No, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And Jeff, please get us started.
Yeah, Bob, such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Would love for you to just share with our listeners a little bit about what it was like growing up in the Caldwell family, some of the values that were caught and taught, and then as you go through that, some fun stories, but also what are you hoping to then pass on to the next generations that you picked up in that household?
Yeah, so I literally don't remember a time that family and business just wasn't integrated. Mom and dad started the business in 1975. We lived on about 30 acres of property. There was a creek that ran down the middle of the property, and the business was on one side, kind of in the backyard, and the home was on the other. And I literally grew up kind of hopping across the creek and running down to check and see what dad was up to, or working, or that sort of thing. And it was just a part. What happened that day at work for him was just a part of the dinner conversation around the table. And so I just kind of grew up in it. And I remember as a kid in elementary school, when kids would talk, what does their dad do? I mean, I sat in meetings with him. Like I knew what he did, and so many of my friends really had no idea. They couldn't describe it, and it was one of those things that I couldn't quite get my mind wrapped around. How do you not know what your dad does day to day? And we as kids, I've got three brothers, or two brothers and one sister, and we all kind of grew up working in the business. Mom and dad were big believers in child labor at the time, and had no problem putting us to work. And I remember about, I don't know, I think it was about the time we turned 12. Everybody else got excited about their 12th birthday. And in our family, when you turned 12, you had to start working your years and hours each summer. And so as a 12-year-old, you had to work 12 hours. But we just grew up doing different things in the business, working with the employees. And I think that was a pretty formative thing for us. There were no special jobs for us as kids. We were, my high school job, I remember, was I cleaned the bathrooms. I didn't get home till after sports practice, and all the operations were shut down, and that was my job to do it. So, but mom and dad actually started the business in 1975, and it actually started not in fragrance, but they were a wholesale greenhouse business. They sold marigolds and tomato plants and cucumber plants, and across the Southeast to grocery stores and garden centers. And it put food on the table, but not much else. It was a hard living. It was a very, very seasonal business that you sort of lived and died by the success of that spring bedding plant season. And, during the day, Dad dialed for dollars on the phone in the basement of our house, and uh, uh, kind of managed the operation and the few employees that he had in between phone calls. And then at night, the trucks would come in and load the trucks. And there were many a night that Mom and Dad would take us as kids down. And I can remember falling asleep on top of pallets. And they'd take us back home and put us in beds. So a lot of work, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And Dad was always trying to find a way to do two things. He hated selling. So how do I get off the phone? And growing plants, you couldn't really take a vacation. You had to take care of them. And they kind of like having a bunch of kids. Plants are not self-sustaining, and so he was always looking for a way to kind of offset the seasonal nature of that plant business. And all of his friends in the greenhouse business said, "You got to grow poinsettias." And poinsettias don't turn red at Christmas time naturally. It's a tropical plant, and so you have to play with the light and the heat. And Dad never could get his poinsettias to turn at Christmas. They always turned in March, and you couldn't give them away in March. So he was always. I just tried a lot of different things. And Mom went to a craft fair one day. But they shut down the main street of our town in Spartanburg one weekend each spring for the Spring Fling Festival. And they're artists and people selling different wares on the side of the street. And she was just walking down one Saturday morning, and there was one booth that was just packed with people. She couldn't figure out, was somebody performing at the front, what was going on. And so she kind of worked her way up to the front and realized that they were selling something, and people were passing dollar bills right and left and scooping something out of a jar and putting it in a Ziploc bag. And there was sort of a fragrance as she got to the front, and she realized they were scooping what looked like dirt and putting it in Ziploc bags. And so she handed her dollar bill over and took a scoop and took it home and took it to Dad, and was like, "I have no idea what this is, but it was selling like crazy." And he took one look at it and he said, "You know exactly what that is." He said, "That's vermiculite." And she said, "Vermiculite what?" And he said, "We've got truckloads of it down at the greenhouses. We put it into the potting soil. It holds several times its weight in water, and condition the soil with it." And didn't take Dad too long, and he had sourced some fragrant soil, grabbed a bag of the vermiculite from the greenhouses, Mom's Harvest Gold Sunbeam mixer, and had set up a lab in the basement and was mixing fragrance and vermiculite. And they kind of had an idea that Ziploc bags probably weren't the packaging of the future. And he got an artist to design some artwork and basically developed a little scented envelope sachet in the basement of the house. And about that same time, Dad had gotten, my uncle had actually given him, maybe they were over having dinner, and he had noticed a book sitting there that was about direct mail. And direct mail was in its infancy at that time. You got no junk mail, and it was either a letter or a bill that came in the mail, but there was no junk mail at that time. And he dog-eared one page in that book that said, if you can find a way to send a sample that people can experience with your mailing, your response rate goes through the roof. And so it was a relatively inexpensive product. And Dad said, "I think we could probably do a small size of this and do a mailing." And so Mom and Dad kind of took the majority of their savings from that plant season and invested in a test mailing of several thousand mailers that went out to different independent gift shops and boutiques across the country. And Mom came home one day, picked us up from school, and we had a circular driveway, and the mailbox was on the upper end, and she had pulled in to the lower end, but she couldn't figure out. She kind of see we had a black mailbox, and she couldn't figure out what was going on with the mailbox, and because it looked white. And so, we got out of the car. She walked up the driveway to check the mail, and she's like, "What in the world?" The mailman we were the first house on the street, and she's like, "The mailman must have just decided not to deliver the mail today, and he had tied mail all around the outside of the mailbox." And she got there and opened it and realized the mailbox was stuffed full, and she couldn't figure out what was going on. And so she opened first piece of mail, and it was an order and a check. And she opened the next piece of mail, and it was an order and a check, and came to realize that was the response. And
Wow.
just had a phenomenal response. Began to continue sending out direct mail, kept the greenhouses going, and then middle 80s, after 3 or 4 years of kind of operating both, it looks brilliant in hindsight.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was a gutsy move that Mom and Dad made, because the greenhouse business, while it wasn't extraordinarily profitable, or didn't have great cash flow, but it was what was putting food on the table. And the fragrance side of the business was very small. At that point in time, nobody really fragranced their home like they do today. Most of the fragrances in the house were in household cleaners and chemicals. And if they did, it was right around the holidays at Christmas time. So it was another very seasonal business. But Dad felt there was a bigger future in fragrance in the scented envelope sachet than the greenhouse business. And so at the end of that growing season, they decided to shut down the greenhouses and focus on fragrance. And it has been a lot of ups and downs over the years. Dad has a saying that growth never occurs on a straight line, and boy, for us, it has not. It has been a lot of years of sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and there have been some years that it's been no steps forward and 3 steps back. But Dad has always, we've kind of got an internal saying within the family and the business that willing to try and willing to fail. And he has always been willing to kind of place small bets, try things. And, a lot of times people look at the business today and are like, oh my goodness, everything they touch has worked. And the reality is you only see the things that survived. There are 10 times as many things that we have failed at, and some of which have almost done us in as a company sometimes.
So that's a good word. Sometimes we look at a business like yours and see, oh, that's amazing. What could be better than having a successful fragrance business? It must have been just like everything turned to smelling good, but there was some non-smelling good days in between. But I'm going to take you back a little bit, Bob, so you were about what age when this whole experiment was happening? That when the mail showed up?
When the mail showed up, I was probably I don't know, 10, 11, 12,
so that had
somewhere in that.
That had to have an impact on you, and then those next few years. So walk us through your involvement in the business. What are any fun stories, and then school, meeting meeting Sarah, and just walk us through a little bit of that, and then Jeff's going to have some questions about your career.
I think probably some formative experiences for me were really just working on the front lines with employees. And I think being I probably started really working in the business probably from 5 years old to let's say probably 14. When I turned 15, I kind of went and got my own job outside of the
Oh, okay.
outside of the business. Once we turned 15, you pretty much had to have a summer job that, you know, it was going to be 20 to 40 hours a week. You could either do it in the business or you needed to go do it outside. And I decided to do it outside. But I think it was really formative for me to be able to just work side by side with employees and just to be able to hear conversations, to hear struggles that I don't know. I think a lot of times as the son or the daughter of a business owner, maybe you're insulated from that because you're not actually working in the business at that age. And I think also being that age, I became a little bit, you know, as you get older, people are maybe a little more careful, but you're somewhat invisible.
Right.
And, you know, I probably heard a lot of things that I shouldn't have heard and got a lot of life lessons probably earlier than mom and dad would have preferred that I learn about them. But I think it was just a really formative experience to be able to hear just real life struggles of people and not grow up in a bubble.
So in addition to those, some of those, hearing some of the struggles, you talked earlier about the value of hard work and faith was prevalent. Talk about that in your spiritual formation from, you know, you're 14, you're in those very formidable years. What did that look like? And then how did that carry through to school?
Probably one of the more formative things that kind of three formative things maybe in my middle school and high school years. One, mom and dad were involved in funding with the Jesus film early on. And dad took me on a 6-week trip between, and I have no idea how he took 6 weeks off from the business at that point in time, but took me on a 6-week trip to Thailand, India, and Nepal.
Wow.
And we spent 6 weeks.
How old were you?
I was probably, let's call it 13, 14.
Wow, that had to be formational. Wow.
Yep. And so we were basically just living with the film teams that were out in the villages showing the Jesus film. And it was just a pretty profound experience it's one thing to go on a 1-week trip somewhere. It's a whole nother thing to be in a different culture at that age. And you know, we lived with families in the villages. There were nights that there was no cot or bed, and we slept on a dirt floor. And that's a pretty profound experience for a first world 13 or 14.
That had to impact your worldview even to today, probably.
Absolutely. I absolutely think that it does. And when you're living with people, you get to, it's one thing to go as a tourist, and we were still tourists, but we were living with families, you know, for days at a time. So you really kind of get to know people when you're in their home in a different way culturally than you do otherwise. And, you know, another really formative thing I think was dad was incredible. It's one thing to write a check. It's easy to write a check. And sometimes I think we put too much value on the check writer. And one of the things dad did is he was deeply engaged with one or two, as far back as I could remember, with one or two people that were living at the margins. And I kind of call it entering into the story of another.
Yeah.
And he truly did enter into the story of another. And one in particular was a gentleman named Charlie, and Charlie worked for Dad since the early days. And Charlie had some mental limitations, emotional limitations, and probably functioned more like a 12 to 14-year-old kid, always constantly coming back for Dad's approval. And he and Dad were the same age. And Dad over the years was just always pouring into Charlie. And when Charlie had a stroke when he was probably 48, was unable to work anymore, and Dad just took care of Charlie on a regular basis. Even if you talk to our kids, Papa would give them, they'll say, Papa gave, what you doing? Papa called me and I need to, sent me to the grocery store and I've got to run some things over to Charlie. And Dad kind of found ways to engage everybody in the caring of these people. But I think it was just, he's running a business, but he always has had a singular sort of relationship that he's been engaged in. And it's been pretty powerful because writing the check's easy, engaging relationships, it's messy, it's inconvenient. But boy, has there been so much good that's come from it. And, I think when just in his example of bringing us along, there were times that we're like, oh, Dad, come on, do we have to go see Charlie? And but boy, those relationships have been, you can kind of look at it and people might say that, oh man, Charlie was so lucky to have your dad. But I think Dad would say, and I can certainly say for me personally, I think we were transformed far more than Charlie was.
That's rich. So Bob,
through those relationships.
I'm going to turn this over to Jeff in a minute. Before we leave this kind of season, what are you obviously have a deep respect and love for your parents and have picked up a lot of what they caught and what was caught and what they taught. How are you transferring that baton of those faith and those core values to the next generation and next generations? What do you think?
Boy,
some of those tips.
I hope we're doing a good job at it. So they would probably be better ones to answer that question than I would. But
maybe a different way of asking it would be, what advice do you have for someone in your season who's picked those things up from their, from the generation before them and are now looking, to pass that on?
I think it is far less taught than caught by modeling. I think I have picked up far more from watching Dad than I have from necessarily the instruction that came out of his mouth. And since you guys are specifically speaking to business owners, I think one of the things that Dad did, there never was a compartmentalization with Dad between business and family and faith. It was like, it really was just an integrated whole. And sort of the way that played out is he invited us into the business, into the data, not at certain points in time, but allowed us as kids to kind of what may be an interruption. I think he utilized it as, he's very intentional, but I think he used those interruptions as means of instructing. And a lot of it was, he might be in a meeting and I come home from after school and I've got my snack and just sticking my head in to say hey to Dad, and he's in a meeting and he says, hey, come on in and sit down. And I'd just sit down and eat my snack in his meeting. And, it's little things of uh, 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 listening to him pray uh, uh, before a meeting. And not just that, but the way in which he prayed at the same time. Uh,
Bob, let me ask you
he
this.
just,
Let me ask you
go ahead.
this. Let me ask you this. Take us through. Now, you went to Wheaton, right?
I did.
Talk about that, and then sort of post-college, sort of your role in
Yep.
this. And
Yeah,
let's kind of move it from that generation into
absolutely.
your generation and the next.
Yep, absolutely. I had a youth pastor when I was probably 14, 15, 16, really poured into me and saw something in me from a leadership standpoint that probably I didn't see at all, and gave me a lot of opportunities. But I guess it was about my sophomore year, really kind of had, while I'd grown up in a family that faith was important, I walked down the aisle as best I could, and understanding what I was doing and committing my life to the Lord as, I think probably an 8-year-old. I wouldn't say that my faith completely became my own until 10th grade. And at that point in time, really felt a call to youth ministry. And employees would ask me, I remember employees would ask me all the time in high school, "So Bob, you're going to come back and take over the business?" And I had no desire to ever come back into the business. I really kind of felt like God had called me into ministry and youth ministry within the church. And that's why I went to Wheaton, was to really prepare me for that. And while there, I got super involved in prison ministry while at Wheaton, and really kind of felt like, well, maybe the Lord's kind of calling me more to work in sort of the juvenile justice system. Did an internship my junior year of college as a chaplain in a prison here back home, and kind of realized there was too much compartmentalization. I'd grown up in a family that you did not leave work at the door. When you walk out, it's just fully integrated. And I really struggled with walking through that fence at 5 o'clock every day, and just left everything behind me. And my sophomore year at Wheaton, we had chapel 3 days a week, and showed up second semester of my sophomore year, and I have never paid such close attention in chapel as I did that sophomore year. I could not tell you who spoke or what they said. My attention was focused on the girl that sat 3 rows in front of me on the end, right between me and the podium up front. And that was Sarah, and who's now my wife. And I remember all through Wheaton, kind of got focused on going into youth ministry, got to my senior year, and we were engaged in January of my senior year. And I started interviewing at churches. And for one reason or another, as I interviewed, either I just didn't feel like things were quite right at the church I was interviewing at, and just didn't feel like that was where I was supposed to be, or they decided I wasn't the right candidate for them. But I got to about the end of April and went, I'm getting married. Oh my goodness, I have got to get a job. And I still had interviews lined up. And so I picked up the phone and called Dad and said, I just need to make some money for a honeymoon. And I will do anything you need me to do. But I'm probably not going to be there long. I've got interviews already scheduled through the back half of May and into July. And I need a job where I've got the freedom to go interview, and I can leave when it's time to leave. And he said, come on in. And so I came back, and at that point in time, the business was going through explosive growth. We were growing about 100 to 150% a year.
Wow.
For about 3 years, and really went from an operation that Dad was running behind our house, that we needed another facility. And so I showed up, and my very first job was Mom and Dad had bought another facility, about 100,000 square feet, that was about 45 minutes away. And Dad put me in the car. We drove to it. And my first job, nothing was automated. We were completely manual, and we could not keep up. And so my first job was to hire about 200 people to hand fill these sachets.
Oh, wow.
And so I got thrown into the HR deep end. But what I came to realize, and it was really through Sarah's question. I went up to visit. She was a semester behind me, and I went up to visit her that fall, and I was just a grump. And she's like, "What is going on?" And I'm like, "I'm just frustrated. I'm kind of frustrated with God. I spent 4 years going to study to be a youth pastor. Nothing is working out from an interview standpoint. And I'm back in the family business." And she asked me a question as I was leaving to hop back on the plane to come back to South Carolina from Chicago. She said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Are you enjoying what you're doing?" And I was so focused on what I felt like I was supposed to be doing, what I had spent 4 years trying to do, that I really hadn't stopped, and I couldn't get the question out of my mind. And I came to realize I love what I'm doing right now. And this business, these 200 employees, most of whom may not darken the door of a church, are walking in our building every day. This is my ministry.
Yeah. There we go.
This is the ministry that God has called me to. And so 30 years later, I'm still doing it.
So Bob, talk about that. So you said the business is a ministry. How does that manifest itself?
Boy, there are things I think that in a business, we spend 8-10 hours a day at work every day, facing all sorts of real life dilemmas and ethical decisions, and how do we treat people, and how do we respond. And when we look at going to church, how many times have the kids been fighting? Sarah and I have been arguing. You hop out of the door to go to church, and it's all smiles. And you're there for 2 hours, and an absolute impact can happen in those 2 hours, and does happen in those two hours. But I think sometimes there can be a disconnect between how does this apply to my life. And my prayer is that it's really, God's called us to be salt and light. And that in and through the way I lead, the way that I interact, and I am a failure. I am a failure, but my hope is that I would be salt and light, and that in and through my actions, people would get small tastes and small glimpses of God's goodness, and that in walking through our doors, our employees, our suppliers, our customers would have opportunities to taste and see the goodness of God.
What are some of the tangible ways you think that happens?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Dad implemented in the business, he just felt this and this was probably 35 years ago, maybe 37 years ago. We've been in business. Next year we'll have been in business for 50 years. But Dad just had this sense from God that God wanted him to start a devotion. at work, kind of a devotion and prayer time on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That people, if they could come in, clock in, it'd be paid time. If they want to come, great. If they want to go for a walk, if they want to go sit in their car, if they want to get started working, he was fine with whatever, but he just didn't know that he was the one to do it. And he had a right-hand person that worked for him named Ben. And Dad was just kind of fighting with this and struggling. And Ben came in and he said, I've just kind of been thinking and praying. And he's like, I don't know if you would be open to this or not. He's like, would you be open if I would do a devotion a couple of times a week in the mornings in the business? And Dad was like, well, I've kind of been praying about that. And so Dad started that, and we continue that today. It's completely voluntary if people want to come. But if you were to look at some of our employee surveys and that sort of thing, people would rate that as one of the top benefits within our business. And I think it's really it shaped our culture. It has a way of grounding you and bringing you back into perspective. But I also think that it's opened the door for our, when we kind of look at our human resource department, it's not just a legal team of people. We're really trying to hire people in our HR team that have shepherd's hearts. It's somewhat of a pastoral role, and those devotions have really opened up conversations with people and given us some pretty unique ways to be able to care for our employees and the struggles that they're going through.
I mean, before we started recording, Jeff Rutt was talking about how there are many forms of generosity. And I know you give away money, and I mean, that's a whole nother podcast, is the things you're supporting, from prison ministry to anti-trafficking things. And so I know you're very involved in those things, but I think you're painting a great picture. Thanks for sharing those things, because I think you're painting a great picture of how do you just serve your employees. And of course, if you're serving them, and of course, the way they serve the customer, that culture, and the vendors and that sort of thing. But I think it's a very, you clearly, what's coming through to me is you have a pastor's heart. So like, it's cool that God's using you, like that pastor's heart, even the way you're talking about HR. I've never heard it said that way, that you're training the HR people to think as pastors, basically, as shepherds. And it makes me, it's sort of in contrast even to, the Green family, or David Green of Hobby Lobby and that kind of thing. He was one of many children, all that were missionaries and went to church. And he always calls himself the black sheep that didn't go that direction. But clearly he's in ministry too. But anyway, how do you think about that pastor's heart that God gave you? And how do you kind of think about, have you reconciled that, or do you still kind of harbor this?
No, absolutely.
How does it exercise itself?
No, I mean, I think I've completely reconciled. I think there are times that I've struggled a little bit with the disconnect within the church of the call to full-time ministry as being more of a pastor and that sort of thing. But I mean, I don't know. I can just look back over my past and see that even in the failures, even in mysterious ways that I didn't understand, God was ordering my steps. And I don't know that he would have gotten me to Wheaton had he not placed that sense of a call to ministry. And the only ministry that felt comfortable to me at the time was youth ministry. And I'm a 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid, and God used that. But I don't know that I would have ever gone and studied theology and Christian formation.
A great perspective. You got the training you needed anyway. It just where you applied it is just different.
Yeah. Well, plus, and I kind of, people ask me, do you regret going and studying theology and Christian formation and not business? And I wouldn't go back and do it differently for all the money in the world. Yeah. Because I can go anywhere to study any topic for a week, 2 weeks, that I need on business, that I
Right.
need on accounting. There's no other place, not too many other places that I could have gotten that formative training
Well,
that I
and there
got
was
to
that,
prepare me to look at business as my ministry.
yeah, and there was that whole thing. That is where you met Sarah too.
It
So
is where I met Sarah, and
there is
that's the
that.
best thing
Yeah.
that's ever happened to me.
Let's make sure we get that in there. But
Yeah.
well, listen, I know we're wrapping up here, and it's just I just love how these stories unpack themselves about this arc of, everybody's got such a unique path that God's got laid out for them. And it's just so cool that it's just, there's just no two stories that are the same. And so, like,
Mhm.
jumping over the creek, helping out, going to get the other job, I'm going to go, I'm going to go be a youth pastor. So God gave you this pastor's heart, and then you apply it. You actually have a church of thousands of people that you affect through the business.
Yeah.
And it is a ministry, and it's just
Absolutely.
awesome. And I know there's a million other things we could talk about that we didn't get to, but I just think that is enough for somebody out there. I was just yesterday in a C12 meeting where there's some newer people trying to think this way, and they just need some practical tips on how do they get started on affecting the culture. Some of them have bought businesses, and they're really trying to change the culture. What tips might you give somebody that's maybe a little behind you on the journey? Maybe they just bought a business, maybe they're trying to affect that culture. You have such a heart for the employees. What are a couple of things they can do?
Boy, I'm gonna kind of go two directions on it. One's going to be a principle that there is a conference that our family attends every year together, and gosh, it's probably been 12 years ago now. I remember that there was a speaker, and it's primarily a group of philanthropists and business owners that are in that room. And I remember the speaker said, you guys are a group of people that own great assets, have great talents. And he said, I want you to know the greatest thing you'll ever steward is not your money, not your time, and not your treasure. The greatest thing you'll ever steward is God's whispers. And
Did you say whispers?
whispers. The greatest thing you'll ever steward is God's whispers. And it's a constant question of what do I do with his whispers?
Wow.
Do I sit on them or do I act? And
Are you even listening?
or are you
I mean,
even
let's
listening?
start there.
Like, and it's a prayer of God, give me a heart that's soft. Give me ears to hear, and give me eyes to see, and then give me the courage to act.
Yeah.
But because those whispers I've always found that they always lean into a strength that exists.
Yep.
It leans into something that builds on experience that I have, but it is never in my comfort zone. And it always leads me to a place of risk and to a place of dependence. And so, I'd kind of park that as, what do you do with God's whispers? And I think the second thing that I do, and I'm not approaching this really with practical things, because like, I think everybody's context is different. And so it's real hard to be prescriptive and say,
I actually
go
think,
do this.
No. I thought that was extremely practical, just so you know.
Okay, good. And then, I think the other thing that was transformative for me, and this came from my time at Wheaton, is I had a theology professor that took a lot of classes from Gary Burge. And one of the things that he taught us is you can't read the Bible through the lens of today.
Yeah.
Like you have to read it through the lens of the culture in which it was written. and then you've got to translate what that means into today's practices. And a book that has been extraordinarily helpful for me within the business is a book called Practicing the King's Economy, by I think it's Rhodes and Brian Fickert. I think there were 3 authors. I think there were 2 of them. But one of the things I realized maybe 5 years ago is that the Bible was written to an agrarian culture.
Yeah.
And we live in a very, very post-agrarian culture. And so I went back and just read it through an agrarian lens, and Practicing the King's Economy really helped me do that. And there's so many principles that are lost on us because we don't see it through that lens. The principle of gleaning, and the principle of gleaning like pushes back on profit maximization.
Right.
It's not harvesting to the edge of the fields. It's leaving something. And it's the practice of giving of first fruits from the first of the harvest, which really comes down to how do I intentionally develop some habits within my life that foster dependence? How do I keep myself in a state of dependence? And it's a constant battle because I don't want to be dependent. But I think that practice of gleaning is how can I apply that to the business, and it's always in care for those at the margins. And so as someone is kind of struggling through how do I shape culture, and wanting to do it in a very gospel centered way, I'd kind of lean into those three principles. How do I intentionally foster a sense of dependence? How do I practice gleaning in a modern sense in my business? And how do I listen, and what do I do with those whispers?
So here's what I'm hearing. I mean, I almost yelled, "Preach it, Bob." This is listen, this is awesome.
Yeah.
I think you could almost combine those two things, and you did kind of there at the end where at first you were talking about the whispers, but it's like if you can pray, if we can pray about applying those timeless principles of gleaning and first fruits, let's pray about those, and then listen to the whisper of what to do individually. It's probably a little different from the way Jeff or you or I might apply it. That's the beauty of God. We're going through some strategic things that are very challenging, that we feel like God's telling us to do. And I was just thinking this morning, we cannot do it unless He does it. Like it's too big, it's too different, all of those things. So anyway, you're ministering to me at this moment. I know you're ministering to many others. As we wrap up here. Jeff, did you have something to say for me?
It's really powerful, Bob. Thanks for sharing that. It reminds me of Andy Crouch's book, Strong and Weak. That's that intersection of authority and vulnerability. We don't necessarily like being vulnerable and being in a vulnerable place, but that puts us in a place of dependence on what only God can do. And that's what I hear you saying. And sometimes you have to be in the habit of looking for those opportunities. Yeah.
Well,
really strong.
Bob, can't thank you enough for being with us and sharing your story today. It was a real blessing. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. It was an honor to be with you guys.
Thank you,
Jeff.
Bob.
Always great to be with you. And thanks everybody for joining us on this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. Subscribe, share it with a friend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.